Forget everything you think you know about where the Irish came from. The story sold to tourists and stitched into family trees, an unbroken bloodline running straight back to the Celts, is probably the most persuasive wrong idea in the whole field of Irish ancestry. It feels true. It's repeated everywhere, and it doesn't survive contact with the genome. Here's the number that should stop that story cold. Modern Irish DNA carries less than 10% of the genetic material that existed on this island 4,500 years ago. Not diluted, not blended, mostly gone. Before anything resembling Irish DNA ever existed, 3 entirely separate populations had already lived, died, and been replaced on this land. And the most recent of those overhauls, the one that finally produced something close to the genetic Ireland we'd recognize today, happened only 4,000 years ago. In geological terms, that's not ancient history. That's last week. The people who first set foot on Irish soil, whenever that was, looked nothing like the population walking around the island today. Different skin, different ancestry, different everything. And for most of the last decade, the lab quietly proving this, skeleton by skeleton, has been Trinity College Dublin's ancient DNA unit, pulling genomes out of tombs and cyst burials, and rewriting the origin story almost every time they publish. So if the Irish aren't descended from the people who first settled Ireland, who are they actually descended from? That question has 3 answers, and they arrived roughly 4,000 years apart. If you're the type who likes finding out your ancestors weren't who you thought, stick around, hit subscribe, there's a lot more of this coming. Start with the version of Irish history sold in genealogy shows and tourist boards. One continuous Celtic identity, unbroken, stretching back millennia. It's a clean story, it photographs well. And in the early 2010s, a group of geneticists at Trinity College Dublin, working alongside archaeologists at Queen's University Belfast, decided to actually test it, not with folklore, but with whole genome sequencing pulled directly from ancient remains. Their first targets were specific: a Neolithic woman buried in a tomb at Ballynahattie near Belfast, and 3 Bronze Age men recovered from a burial on Rathlin Island. The resulting study appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on December 29, 2015, the first time whole ancient Irish genomes had ever been sequenced and published. Lead geneticist Dan Bradley was blunt about what they didn't know going in. He described the origins of Irish genetic heritage as essentially unknown, despite the fact that Ireland sits at genuine extremes for several major inherited traits. Extremes that demanded an explanation nobody had yet supplied. What the sequencing actually turned up wasn't continuity. It was replacement, twice over. And both replacements happened before the Celtic period most people associate with Ireland had even begun. So the story doesn't start with the Celts at all. It starts 10,000 years earlier, with people who didn't look Irish in any sense we'd recognize today. Strip away the folklore and the finding is almost mechanical in its simplicity. Ireland's modern genetic makeup was assembled in 3 separate waves: hunter-gatherers first, then farmers, then Bronze Age migrants from the steppe. Each wave didn't gently blend into the one before it. Each one substantially displaced it. The final wave is the one that matters most for anyone alive today. Arriving around 4,000 years ago, it's the wave that laid down what researchers call the insular Atlantic genome, the genetic foundation now shared by the Irish, the Scottish, and the Welsh. Everything that came before that wave, including the farming society that built Newgrange, is genetically almost a different population from modern Ireland. Not a variation on it, a different population entirely. That final wave also explains 2 things doctors in Ireland deal with constantly. Ireland today sits at world maximum frequency for specific gene variants tied to lactose tolerance, and separately, for variants tied to iron metabolism. Both trace directly back to the people who arrived 4,000 years ago. None of this was visible from archaeology alone. Pottery styles and burial customs could hint at change, but they couldn't prove whether new ideas had spread or new people had actually arrived. It took ancient DNA sequencing, only possible from the 2010s onward, to settle the question for good. Go back 10,000 years, before farming, before megaliths, and Ireland's first inhabitants looked almost nothing like what comes to mind when most people picture them. Ireland's first human occupants arrived roughly 10,000 years ago, and they held the island to themselves for about 4,000 years before farming ever reached its shores. For most of that stretch, nobody knew what these people actually looked like, until DNA reconstruction, announced in an RTE documentary filmed in the Burren, County Clare, and fronted by Trinity College Dublin geneticist Dr. Lara Cassidy, filled in the picture directly from their genetic code. The results were unambiguous. These hunter-gatherers carried none of the gene variants responsible for light skin pigmentation in modern Europeans. Their skin tone, according to the research, was dark to black. At the same time, they carried the genetic markers for blue eyes, a combination that doesn't match a single modern population anywhere. They were also noted as taller than the farming population that would eventually replace them, some 4,000 years later. This wasn't a one-off Irish anomaly. A nearly identical pigmentation profile, dark skin paired with blue eyes, turned up independently in a 7,000-year-old Mesolithic genome recovered in Logroño, Spain, in research led by Carla Laluisa Fox. Two separate hunter-gatherer populations, hundreds of miles apart, carrying the same unlikely combination. It suggests this wasn't a local quirk of Ireland's first people. It was simply what a European hunter-gatherer looked like, full stop. And yet, for all that time on the island, these hunter-gatherers left almost no direct genetic trace in the population that exists in Ireland today. The people who were there the longest, 4,000 years, longer than any population since, contributed the least to what Irish DNA actually means now. The farmers who came next looked closer to what most people would expect. Their DNA tells a very different origin story. Around 6,000 years ago, farming reached Ireland, and it didn't arrive as an idea passed among existing hunter-gatherers. It arrived with people. The clearest evidence sits in a single burial, a woman interred in a megalithic tomb at Ballynahattie, near Belfast. Radiocarbon dated to 3343-320 BC, roughly 5,200 years old. Her genome was sequenced at 10.3x coverage, detailed enough for researchers to reconstruct not just her ancestry, but elements of her actual appearance. Genetically, she traced predominantly to Near Eastern origins, part of the same farming migration that had already spread agriculture across the Mediterranean before pushing into Atlantic Europe. A facial reconstruction built from that genetic data, produced by Elizabeth Black, gave her black hair and brown eyes. She resembled a Southern European far more closely than she resembled anyone living in Ireland today. This was the population that would go on to build Ireland's megalithic monuments, the same architectural tradition that produced the most famous structure on the entire island. That monument-building culture reached its peak in the Boyne Valley, in a structure older than the pyramids of Giza. Newgrange sits in the Boyne Valley, County Meath, and it was built roughly 5,000 years ago, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids of Giza. The scale alone is difficult to process. Construction is estimated to have required 200,000 tons of material, some of it hauled from as far as 70 kilometers away, using nothing but Neolithic tools and manpower. The engineering embedded in the structure is even harder to explain away as coincidence. On the winter solstice, and only on the winter solstice, sunrise light travels down the tomb's narrow passage and floods the inner chamber. That kind of precision, built into stone 5 millennia ago, has kept archaeologists arguing for decades over exactly what kind of society could organize labor on this scale. Was this the product of a stratified elite commanding a workforce, or a broader collective effort, a whole community pulling together toward one shared purpose? Newgrange doesn't stand alone either. It belongs to a much wider passage tomb tradition that stretches across the island, including major cemeteries at Carrowmore and Carrowkeel in County Sligo, roughly 150 kilometers to the west. For decades, everything researchers could say about who built these places and why came from architecture and archaeology alone. Stone alignments, pottery styles, burial patterns. That was the entire evidence base. Until a genomics team made a different decision. Instead of reading the stones, they went looking for the DNA of the people buried inside them. In 2020, that sequencing produced a finding nobody on the team expected. Lara Cassidy and Dan Bradley's team at Trinity College Dublin sequenced 44 whole genomes pulled from Mesolithic and Neolithic Irish remains, publishing their results in Nature on June 18, 2020. Buried among those 44 individuals was one that stood apart from everything else in the dataset. He was an adult male, interred in the most elaborate recess of the Newgrange Passage tomb chamber, the most prestigious burial position in the entire monument. When researchers examined his genome, they found something startling. His two inherited copies, one passed down from each parent, were almost identical to one another. That's the unmistakable genetic signature of extremely close inbreeding. Further analysis confirmed it beyond doubt. This man's parents were first-degree relatives, either siblings or a parent and their own child. Lara Cassidy, reflecting on the result, said she'd never seen anything like it in the data. First-degree incest at this level isn't scattered randomly through history. It shows up almost exclusively among ruling dynasties, Egyptian pharaohs, Inca god kings, and a handful of similarly inbred royal lines across different continents and centuries. The pattern is specific, and it's rare enough that researchers don't reach for it lightly. What tipped the interpretation for this particular burial was the location itself. This wasn't an unmarked grave on the periphery. This was the most prestigious chamber in one of the most significant Neolithic monuments in Europe. The prestige of the burial is what led researchers to conclude the union wasn't accidental or incidental. It was socially sanctioned. So the same tomb engineered to track the sun's return on the shortest day of the year may also have been built, in part, to protect a bloodline. The Newgrange man wasn't a genetic isolate, buried alone with no connection to anyone else on the island. Researchers traced distant familial ties running between him and individuals interred at other passage tomb sites entirely. Those ties reached Carrowmore and Carrowkeel, the major passage tomb cemeteries in County Sligo, roughly 150 kilometers to the west of Newgrange. A further connection turned up at the Millen Bay Monument in County Down, a site whose unusual shape had puzzled archaeologists for years, since it didn't conform to the typical layout of passage tombs elsewhere on the island. Millen Bay had already shown hints of belonging to this same tradition. Its megalithic art and its Carrowkeel-style pottery suggested a connection long before anyone had genetic proof. The ancient DNA confirmed what the artifacts had only implied. Dr. Eileen Murphy of Queen's University Belfast described the geographic spread of these connections as suggestive of widespread and enduring relationships. Links between regions separated by several hundred miles, all tied together through this one extended family network. Lara Cassidy summarized the finding in a single line. What the team had uncovered was a powerful extended kin group, one with access to elite burial sites across many regions of the island, sustained for at least half a millennium. And here's where the story gets stranger, because a 1,000-year-old piece of folklore seems to already know the ending. Long before any of this genetic work existed, a medieval Irish legend was already circulating, first recorded in the 11th century AD, roughly 4,000 years after Newgrange itself was built. The story describes a builder king who restarted the daily solar cycle by sleeping with his own sister. The neighboring passage tomb at Douth still carries a trace of this legend, baked directly into its name. The Middle Irish place name for the site, Tershuile, translates roughly to Hill of Sin, rooted in the very same story. Researchers working on the genetic study had already been struck by how precisely Newgrange's solstice alignment functioned, which had led scholars to question just how long an oral tradition tied to this place could plausibly survive intact across 4 millennia. Then the genome results landed, and the incest finding gave that centuries-old myth something it had never had before, a literal precedent. Archaeologist Dr. Rose O. Muldoon, who worked on the study, called it extraordinary to discover a potential prehistoric basis for the incestuous element buried inside that legend. Out of all 44 genomes sequenced from Mesolithic and Neolithic Irish remains, only one individual carried this signature, the man interred in Newgrange's single most prestigious chamber. A folk story dismissed for 1,000 years as pure invention may have been carrying something else entirely, a genuinely accurate memory of a real event. That was the story in 2020. 5 years later, a second team went back and pulled it apart. In 2025, a study by Smythe, Carlin, Hoffman, Freeman, Bickle, Cleary, Greene, and Pope, published in the journal Antiquity, returned to the King of Newgrange interpretation and re-examined it from the ground up. Reported through Science Daily on June 23, 2025, the new analysis directly challenges whether a royal, incestuous elite ever actually ruled at Newgrange in the first place. The genetic clustering seen across passage tomb burials, the team argued, reflects relationships that are far more distant than a close dynastic line, comparable to second cousins, or connections spanning several generations back, like a shared great-great-great-grandparent. If Newgrange and its neighboring tombs had truly been reserved for a tight ruling elite, the genetic ties between the people buried there would need to be far closer than what the data actually shows. There's also a problem with the evidence itself. The skull fragment behind the original incest finding, catalogued as NG10, comes with a murky history of its own. Newgrange's interior was heavily disturbed following its rediscovery in 1699, long before any controlled excavation began in the 1960s, leaving real uncertainty about exactly where that fragment originated within the monument. The revised interpretation offered by the 2025 team paints a very different picture. Passage tombs likely reflected broader ties of family, shared work, and community, rather than a hidden royal court. a farming society organized around collective ritual, not concealed dynastic power. The dynastic elite story that made headlines around the world in 2020 may not survive a closer look at the very same data that produced it. Either way, the society that built Newgrange still vanished, not gradually, fading out over centuries, within a few hundred years of a new population arriving from the east. The population that built Newgrange, farmers descended predominantly from Near Eastern ancestry, didn't fade out gradually over centuries. They were overtaken, decisively, by a new migration that arrived around 4,000 years ago. The clearest evidence for this comes once again from Rathlin Island, County Antrim. 3 men buried together in a single cyst burial, radiocarbon dated to 2026 to 1534 BC. One of those 3 genomes was sequenced at 10.5x coverage, detailed enough for researchers to establish substantial Pontic steppe genetic ancestry running through it. Ancestry that traces back to the Yamnaya herders of what's now Russia and Ukraine. Dan Bradley, describing the scale of this migration, called it a great wave of genome change that swept into Europe from above the Black Sea, reaching, in his words, the shores of its most westerly island, that's Ireland. What makes these 3 Rathlin men significant isn't just where their ancestry came from, it's who they resemble. Genetically, these men bore a far closer resemblance to modern people in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales than the earlier Neolithic farmer woman from Ballynahattie ever did. The timing lines up precisely too, roughly 1,000 years after that farmer woman lived, placing this steppe migration squarely at the start of the early Bronze Age, arriving on the island alongside the introduction of metalworking itself. This wasn't simply a shift in where people came from, it was the arrival of the population that modern Ireland would eventually trace itself back to, in a way the Newgrange builders never could. 3 specific traits rode in with these men, and at least one of them is still causing medical problems in Irish hospitals today. The 3 men buried on Rathlin Island carried the most common Y chromosome type found in Ireland today, haplogroup R1b. They also carried the genetic alleles for blue eyes, a clear departure from the brown eye genetics documented in the earlier Neolithic farmer woman. One of the 3 carried something else entirely, something with consequences that reach into the present day. The C282Y mutation responsible for hemochromatosis, a disorder in which the body absorbs and stores excess iron. Hemochromatosis today is so disproportionately common among people of Irish descent that it's sometimes nicknamed the Celtic disease. This single genome places the disorder's entry into the Irish gene pool at, or before, the Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 years ago, right at the moment these steppe migrants arrived. Lead author Lara Cassidy described the genetic affinity between these 3 men and modern Irish, Scottish, and Welsh populations as the strongest match found in any ancient sample tested up to that point. Put plainly, this is where the insular Celtic genetic profile actually begins. This wasn't a small local shift confined to one island cyst burial either. Across the water in Britain, the same migration erased almost the entire existing population. A 2018 Nature study, led by teams working alongside David Reich and Carles Lalueza Fox, found that between 2000 BC, over 90% of Britain's existing gene pool was replaced by bell beaker migrants carrying steppe ancestry, over 90%. And this replacement didn't unfold across a slow, multi-generational drift. It happened within a few hundred years, a demographic turnover rarely matched anywhere in the entire ancient DNA record. The population that was replaced included the very builders of Stonehenge and Britain's other major Neolithic monuments. The incoming beaker population's Y chromosomes, by contrast, were overwhelmingly haplogroup R1b M269. Ireland experienced this same migration slightly later than Britain did, and beaker-associated males recovered from Irish sites were, once again, found to be nearly all R1b. Compare that to Iberia, where a related beaker-era replacement, studied by Olalde and colleagues in 2019, swapped out closer to 40% of existing ancestry, yet still replaced almost 100% of the Y chromosome lineages. That pattern implies something different happened there. Incoming men fathered children with local women, rather than displacing the population outright. The bell beaker migrants themselves weren't a single uniform group either. Genetic analysis shows they were a mixture of incoming steppe ancestry and an earlier resilient hunter-gatherer farmer population that had managed to hold out for millennia in the wetlands of the Lower Rhine. The population responsible for one of the most famous shared monumental traditions in Britain and Ireland's prehistory was almost entirely replaced within a few generations of the beaker migrants' arrival. Every R1b Y chromosome carried by an Irish man today traces back to this single migration event. R1b-M269, along with its downstream branch R1b-L21, are today the dominant Y chromosome lineages across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and parts of Western France. That dominance has a specific point of origin. This lineage's root traces back to the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the same source population responsible for the broader Indo-European expansion that swept across the European continent. Genetic studies of bell beaker burials recovered in Germany and Bohemia show early branches of this exact Y DNA lineage already present there, confirming the migration route ran from Central Europe outward, all the way to the Atlantic edge. A specific sub-branch, R1b-S116, also known as P312, shows a dissemination pattern closely tied to the spread of the beaker complex itself, tracking almost exactly with where beaker artifacts and burials turn up. This steppe-derived Y chromosome lineage arrived in Ireland alongside the very same wave that introduced metalworking to the island, marking the true start of the Irish Bronze Age. There's a further possibility layered into this shift, one that Dan Bradley raised directly in the original 2015 paper. The timing of this genetic transition may also coincide with the introduction of an Indo-European language ancestral to the later Celtic tongues spoken across Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. So the Y chromosome carried by most Irish men today didn't originate in Ireland at all. It originated on a steppe thousands of kilometers away, carried west by people the Newgrange builders never met. Lara Cassidy's 2015 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences describes this Bronze Age steppe arrival as the exact point where central attributes of the insular Celtic genome were established, roughly 4,000 years ago. From this point onward, ancient Irish genomes begin closely resembling the modern populations of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales specifically. This is a meaningfully different population from either the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers or the Neolithic farmers who occupied the very same island before them. Subsequent research, carried out through the Irish DNA Atlas project, would go on to confirm that the modern Irish genetic landscape was essentially locked in during this Bronze Age period, roughly 3,500 years ago. Ireland's world maximum frequencies for specific gene variants, including the variant tied to lactose tolerance, also trace back to this same era. None of this transition was visible in the archaeological record on its own. Pottery, tools, and burial customs could only hint at change. It took genome sequencing, decades later, to confirm definitively that this was population replacement, not the slow spread of new ideas among people who were already there. What happened after that point is a different kind of story. Not replacement this time, but division, as the island itself began splitting into distinct regional genetic zones. Ireland's position at the edge of Europe, isolated by sea for thousands of years, left it carrying unusually high frequencies of several inherited conditions, and every one of them traces back to this ancient population history. Hemochromatosis is the clearest example. This is the same iron overload disorder first detected in the Bronze Age men buried on Rathlin Island, and it remains at world maximum frequency in Ireland today. The gene variant responsible for lactose tolerance sits at a world maximum in the Irish population as well. Beyond those two, cystic fibrosis, coeliac disease, galactosemia, and multiple sclerosis all occur at elevated rates across Ireland compared to mainland Europe. Researchers connect this entire pattern to a specific combination of factors: population bottlenecks that occurred at different points in Irish prehistory, genetic isolation reinforced by Ireland's island geography, and the particular ancestral populations that converged there by the Bronze Age. Small, isolated founder populations tend to concentrate certain genetic variants at unusually high rates, and Ireland's layered history of hunter-gatherers, farmers, and steppe migrants produced exactly that kind of genetic bottleneck. This disease landscape wasn't just a scientific curiosity. It became the direct motivation behind later large-scale genetic mapping projects. Because a small, historically isolated population like Ireland's is unusually valuable for studying how inherited conditions move through a gene pool. That need for a detailed genetic map is exactly what led one research team, decades later, to go looking for the island's hidden regional divisions. Researchers led by Giampiero Cavalieri built what became known as the Irish DNA Atlas, a cohort of 194 individuals, each one selected specifically because they had 4 generations of ancestry tied to a particular Irish region. The study, published in Scientific Reports in 2017, combined this cohort with 2,039 individuals drawn from the peoples of the British Isles dataset, giving researchers a much wider comparison base. The analysis that followed identified 10 distinct, geographically stratified genetic clusters within the Irish population. 7 of those clusters represent purely Gaelic Irish ancestry. The remaining 3 reflect shared Irish-British ancestry. To sharpen the picture further, the team drew on a reference panel of 6,760 European individuals, alongside 2 ancient Irish genomes, and through that comparison they detected notably high levels of Northwest French-like and West Norwegian-like ancestry woven throughout the modern Irish population. All 7 of the Gaelic clusters showed remarkably homogeneous levels of that older Irish ancestry, meaning the genetic foundation laid down in the Bronze Age had held steady across the island for thousands of years, even as regional differences developed on top of it. Ireland isn't one genetic population, it's 10, each one tracing to a specific patch of ground, still detectable in the DNA of people alive today. One of those 10 clusters sits right at a border the researchers weren't expecting to find. Move north across Ireland, and the Irish DNA Atlas analysis identified something unexpected: a major genetic barrier running directly through Ulster, splitting the region from the rest of the island in a way the researchers hadn't anticipated going in. Layered on top of that regional divide, the same dataset picked up clear admixture signals from Norse Viking gene flow into the Irish population. The West Norwegian-like ancestry component detected in the broader analysis is directly tied to this Viking-era contact. Vikings established major settlements at Dublin, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick from the 9th century onward, and the populations descended from those coastal settlements show measurably different admixture profiles compared to the inland Gaelic clusters further from the coast. This Norse genetic layer doesn't replace anything that came before it. It sits directly on top of the Bronze Age steppe-derived foundation that had been laid down roughly 4,000 years earlier, adding to it rather than erasing it. There's a second, more recent admixture signal detected in the same dataset, and it belongs to an entirely different century. This one reflects the 17th century Ulster plantations, when English and Scottish settlers were resettled across the north of Ireland, leaving a distinct genetic fingerprint that Cavalari's team could still isolate centuries later. Move south from Ulster, and the Viking signal fades into a completely different, much older admixture event: the arrival of farmers from the Near East, 6,000 years earlier. What the Irish DNA Atlas ultimately mapped wasn't a single, unified ancestry. It was several distinct historical layers, stacked directly on top of each other across roughly 4,000 years of continuous settlement and resettlement. At the base sits the oldest layer that still matters to modern Irish genetics: the Bronze Age steppe migrants, arriving roughly 4,000 years ago and establishing the R1b dominant, hemochromatosis-carrying genetic foundation that underlies the entire island's population today. On top of that base layer comes centuries of regional divergence, the slow process that eventually produced the 10 distinct genetic clusters identified by Cavalari's team. Layered further still is Norse Viking contact beginning in the 9th century, concentrated specifically in coastal trading settlements rather than spread evenly across the island. And layered most recently of all is the 17th century Ulster plantation settlement, still detectable today as its own distinct admixture signal in the north. Not one of these layers matches the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers or the Neolithic farmers who occupied this same island thousands of years before any of this began. Those earlier populations left almost no trace in what survives today. Put plainly, modern Irish DNA is a record of who arrived, not who was there first. Ancient DNA sequencing has now rewritten the Irish origin story 3 separate times in under a decade. First came the 2015 PennS study establishing the Bronze Age steppe migration. Then came the 2020 Newgrange incest finding, presenting a dynastic elite ruling over Neolithic Ireland. Then came the 2025 reversal, pulling that same finding apart and replacing it with a picture of a more collective, egalitarian society. Each round of research has done the same thing, replaced a tidy, satisfying narrative with a messier one that happens to be better supported by the evidence. The Irish DNA Atlas cohort remains active even now, and researchers continue recruiting participants who can trace 4 generations of ancestry to a specific Irish region, all in an effort to refine that 10-cluster map even further. Whole genome sequencing techniques keep improving year over year, which means burials excavated decades ago haven't finished telling their story. They can still be pulled back out and reanalyzed with methods that simply didn't exist when they were first dug from the ground. The Newgrange debate is the clearest possible example of this in action. The very same skeletal material, reanalyzed 5 years apart by 2 different teams, produced two completely incompatible conclusions about the same Neolithic society. What counted as settled science in Irish population genetics has already changed at least 3 times since 2015, and nothing about the current pace of research suggests that trend is anywhere near finished. If a single skull fragment can flip our understanding of who built Newgrange, what else buried in Irish soil is still waiting to overturn the story?